Hello all, I am Reverend Mark. Welcome to the First Church in Chestnut Hill and to our Sunday service for January 16, 2022. Welcome if it is your first time, welcome if it is your 100th time. I will now read from the book of Psalms, a selection from Psalm 36. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains, your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. O continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your salvation to the upright of heart.
Today's reading from the book of Isaiah was written, historians believe, in the late 5th century or early 4th century BCE by followers of the prophet Isaiah. This places the composition of today's reading after the defeat of the Babylonians by the Persians, the subsequent return of Judeans to Jerusalem from decades of Babylonian exile, and the rebuilding of the temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. The theme of judgment in the earlier books of Isaiah now yields to the themes of restoration and hope in the goodness of God. The book of Isaiah, chapter 62, verses 1 to 5. For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, My delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you.
For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The book of Isaiah is a long and sprawling text that is often broken up into 3 sections to help navigate its various themes. We are in the 3rd section, which describes a time after tribulation. The people of Israel are now to be vindicated. They will be justified. Vindication sometimes implies that someone was not guilty. The Hebrew word used here is tzedek, which generally means righteousness. And this is interesting in this context because in the earlier parts of Isaiah, there's the description of the judgment of God against the people of Israel, which implies that they were not righteous, at least at that time. And the latter parts of Isaiah were written many years later, likely by those who were following in the example of Isaiah. In other words, things changed. The nation shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. There are various moments in the Bible where the names of people change to reflect some fundamental transformation. Abraham, which means father of many, became Abram, which means father of many, became Abraham, father of nations. Abraham had no children, but God promised that his descendants would number like the stars in the sky. Now, Jacob was renamed at the side of a river after a night wrestling with God. Israel, his new name, means one who has struggled with God or who struggles with God, which is an interesting subtlety when you consider the many centuries of struggle between God and the people of Israel. Israel was a person long before it became a place, but their histories are obviously intertwined. And the names of the peoples of the Bible change over times as well. The tribes of Israel, meaning the descendants of Jacob, they become the Hebrew people while they are enslaved in Egypt. Hebrew in this sense means alien in the land, literally one from beyond. The name takes on a different meaning over thousands of years, but when that term Hebrew is used, it has that original character of a group that has been set apart. Eventually, Hebrews follow Moses and travel to the Promised Land. No one who set out from Egypt on that 40-year journey actually makes it there. Even Moses died on the mountains overlooking the land. So the people who would enter the Promised Land had been born wandering all of that time. They would enter the land of Canaan, and they would call the land Israel. They would become Israelites, and they would war against the Canaanites and the surrounding nations for many years. I was thinking about names a lot this week as I considered these words from Isaiah. Names change in the Bible in various ways. Do not forget that Peter was named Simon and Paul was named Saul. Peter the Rock was named by Jesus, though in my heart of hearts I like to think of it as the nickname Rocky. And Paul took the name because he had attained Roman citizenship. And it's easier to go by a familiar name when you travel in such different circles. Sometimes that's to gain a sense of inclusion. Sometimes it's to avoid having people struggle to pronounce an unfamiliar name. Well, names have always fascinated me because in one sense, names are important markers of our identity, but in other ways, they're very strange terms. They're often forgotten portions of history. Most European people did not have last names in the sense that we know them. Sometimes they were place names like Romano, meaning someone from Rome. Sometimes they're occupational names that stayed the same, not because the family had a particular name, but because the family had a particular profession, like Smith or Baker. Then there's the tradition of patronomic names, or taking the name of your father. Johnson, son of John. Anderson, son of Anders. This is still the case in some countries like Iceland, where if your father's name is Stefan, your last name would either be Stephenson or Stefan's daughter, which fascinates me. This becomes complicated if you're trying to run a large bureaucratic government that relies upon tracking people and their families. Such names have at times also turned into clan designations, like the Scottish MacDonald, rather than the patronymic shifting every generation it continues through. First names change more frequently, obviously, and are the personal designations that we often carry through life. But even then, those names change with certain variations or certain choices. Formal names like Elizabeth get parsed out as Liz, Liza, or Beth. John can become Jack, Edward can become Ted. My own name, Mark, has proven mostly immune to nicknameification. It is already so short that adding anything to it just causes you more work. Sometimes people will use different names, middle names, childhood names, names that they choose later in life. I took a Zoom class recently, and very few people were using the names that were under their pictures, because those were the formal school names. Some used their middle names, some used the diminutive forms of their names, and some used names that they had chosen later in life, such as one man who had converted to Islam. And that reminded me of another famous name change, Muhammad Ali, who was born Cassius Clay Jr. When he converted to Islam, he declared that he was leaving behind his slave name, those are his words, and was taking on a name that had meaning for him in his new faith. But if you actually look at his death certificate, you will see that his name was listed as Cassius Clay Jr. They actually spelled his name wrong, but that's different. There's apparently no legal record of him changing his name. And in the 1960s, at least, there was no requirement that you do so for the Social Security Administration or anyone. So on the one hand, it's nice because you get to call yourself what you want, but on the other, you just keep getting mail from people in the government under that former name. This interests me because name changes are so important in the case of this man. He probably faced difficulties because of the change, changing his name when he was already well known, in boxing circles at least, changing it to one in a very different naming tradition, an unfamiliar one in American society at that time. And it doesn't take much work to change your name legally. You just go to the courthouse and fill out some forms. But it can take a lot of work to live with a new name. Sometimes that change will be religious, like Simon becoming Peter because Jesus decided that he was going to rely heavily upon Peter, the rock upon which the church would be built. But it is highly unlikely that Jesus was ever called Jesus during his life. The name Jesus is actually a collection of translation shifts across several languages. The man we know as Jesus would likely have been known as Yeshua bar Yusuf, or Joshua son of Joseph. As the name was translated from English into English from Latin, Latin from Greek, and Greek from Hebrew, it was altered in several ways due to language conventions. So the SH sound in Yeshua becomes S in Greek versions. It's just is not a customary sound, and that becomes Jesus. The initial letter being an I in Latin translations, that happens because there's no equivalent to the letter Y in Latin. And finally, the shift into English, a heavily Germanic language, swaps out the I for a J. Jesus was never called Jesus during his lifetime or the lifetime of the disciples. And it's worth noting that Jesus would never have heard the word Christian. It might be controversial in certain circles to say this, but Jesus and his followers would never have thought of themselves as anything other than Jews. Observant Jews following most, if not all, of the expectations in the Hebrew Scriptures. That terminology changes over time, over centuries. But again, Jesus would never have heard this name for his followers. The word Christian appears in the Bible 3 times. Twice in the book of Acts and once in the letter of Peter, first letter of Peter. It's a new term, meaning the follower of Christ. Not a follower of Jesus or of Yeshua, but a follower of Christ, which means a follower of the Messiah. The timing of its use is important as the persecutions of the disciples starts in the years, decades actually, after the crucifixion of Jesus. And I mention all of this because names have meaning, but they don't always retain that at least exact meaning. Jesus, Paul, and Peter are names we use for men who were known in their lives as Joshua, Saul, and Simon. To call someone a Hebrew was different long ago. To call someone an Israelite is a really ancient label. To call someone Jewish is far later than all of this and comes out of the name Judea, a place name derived from the tribe of Judah, which controlled the area around Jerusalem. Names can have one meaning until those connotations fade away and they are replaced with something else. And Christians have never really been a unified group. Paul spends half of his letters mediating fights between factions of believers. Again, they probably did not refer to themselves as Christians, though. And the Roman church had frequent arguments over doctrine, which led to alternating heresies guiding the church, at least early on. Jesus was God, but he was not man. Well, no, Jesus is man, but he's not God. Well, no, Jesus is both God and man. That last one stuck on for a while. After the Reformation, factions of those following Jesus formed under many different names: Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, Catholics, and on and on. The name Christian is often used as a wide umbrella so that we can all try to fit underneath it. But even that sort of broad sense of unanimity is changing. I read a recent study in which people were asked about the politicization of churches in the United States and how they reacted to the growing link between some churches and some traditions, links between partisan political activity and that religious identity. The study is fascinating, and its findings are actually surprising. If, for example, people perceive a growing link between right-wing politics and religious belief, there is now a growing trend among those people to avoid involvement in church at all. Not avoid the churches that are being political, but to avoid church in general. Church involvement, even religious identity itself is becoming linked among this relatively large group of people to a sense of growing political contentiousness. However, they don't turn to the churches that aren't being politically active or politically outspoken. They just close off to church entirely. It's as if religion itself has become the source of the political fractiousness of our time, and they don't have the time or the patience to sort through the differences. I'm not pointing this out because I think, we as a church, we really should get more overtly political in some direction. I don't think that at all. However, there are moral questions that are important within the lives of people who consider themselves followers of Jesus. And without championing one gang of politicians versus another, it's important to be clear about moral truths that we hold sacred. Now, I spend most Sundays talking about those, and yet I do not spend any time then connecting the political dots for you. Why? Because you're smart people. You're smart people who do not need me to make your political decisions. And it's unfair to say vote for this person versus that person or this party versus that party, because there is more to the decision often than my particular portfolio of social concerns versus what you think is necessary in a community, in a state, or in the nation. Now, I will, of course, share my views on those matters, but I won't do it here. I won't do it in this pulpit. We can do it over a cup of coffee somewhere. But if you ask me about the death penalty, I will preach about that. If you ask me about the moral aspects of immigration, I will preach about that. If you ask me about racial discrimination or diversity, equity, and inclusion, I will preach about those. If it's in the book, in the Bible, I will preach about it. And all of those are in one way, shape, or form. But I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you what party to join. Not only isn't it my job, I consider it a misuse of this space, this pulpit. And I consider it a severe misuse of other pulpits to declare that one party or another is more righteous than the other, more Christian than the other, more something than the other. The name Christian means a follower of Christ. And that description should best be expressed by following the teachings of Christ. It's not a label. It is a promise made to God. Christian does not work as a political label because politics deal with the problems of the moment, of the instance, and not the problems of the soul, not the problems of eternity. And the feverish rhetoric that has been substituted in our country, sometimes for political discourse, will only serve as a barrier when we are called upon to love our neighbors as ourselves. You don't get to object to that instruction by saying, oh, but they're Republicans, they're Democrats, they're conservatives, they're liberals, they're Jews, they're Muslims. You don't get to use those names to withhold the love that God expects us to share with those, even who are our enemies. The names we use, or the names that we use against one another, they have nothing to do with the names God would have us consider. The meek, the poor, the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, the beloved. Those are the only names that matter. All the rest of the names, those are the names that belong to this world. And those have nothing to do with what God calls us to do, and they have nothing to do with who God calls us to be. Amen.
Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like floods before the opening to the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the dark of doubt away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us with the light of day. All thy works with joy surround the earth, and heaven reflect thy rays. Stars and angels sing around the center of unbroken praise. Field and forest, vale and mountain, glory, meadow, flashing sea, chanting bird and flowering fountain, call us to rejoice in thee. Thou art giving and forgiving, everlasting, ever blessed, wellspring of the joy of living, ocean depth of happy rest. Thou our Father, Christ our brother, all who live in love are thine. Teach us how to love each other, lift us to the joy divine. Amen.
Our closing words are a portion of a prayer given by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It has some 1960s gender language, but I will offer the prayer as given, not to edit it with my own words to suit modern ears. Let us pray. God grant that right here in America and all over the world we will choose the highway, a way in which men will live as brothers. A way in which the nations of the world will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. A way in which every man will respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. A way in which every nation will allow justice to run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. A way in which men will do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. A way in which men will be able to stand up, and in the midst of oppression, in the midst of darkness and agony, they will be able to stand there and love their enemies, bless those persons that curse them, pray for those individuals that despitefully use them. And this is the way that will bring us once more into that society which we think of as the brotherhood of man. Amen. Excuse me. Our service is ended. May our service to God and to one another never truly end. Be safe, be well. God bless you all, and goodbye.